Our Brilliant Ruin is a tabletop RPG written by Justin Achille, Pam Punzalan, and Rachel J. Wilkinson of Studio Hermitage. It was published after a successful Kickstarter, and the PDF of the core rulebook is available for the remarkable price of $0. A physical version of the book will be available on Amazon at around the time of this video's release. I'll leave the links below. In this game, you play as a member of a sort of Art Deco, Art Nouveau, post-apocalypse civilization known as the Dramark. Flavor and technology-wise, it's a mix of America and Europe somewhere between 1890 and 1930, but the actual history and culture of this civilization are completely different from our own. Something really bad happened to humanity several generations ago. The light from a distant star reached Earth and started corroding all the metal above ground as well as still underground, and started corrupting animals and humans, turning them into vampires, ghosts, and flesh-eating monsters. This understandably destroyed civilization, obliterating the ruling royal class, and forced society to reformulate into a new class structure. This class structure resulted in three distinct factions: the aristocrats, who have and own; the true folk, who do and make; and the unbonded, who disrupt and rescue. Within these factions are numerous sub-factions, and you as a player can play as any one of them, very likely forming a motley party of PCs who get embroiled in some Victorian, Edwardian flavored aristocratic scandal, or play for power, or labor rebellion, but with a vampire or flesh-eating ghoul thrown in at the worst possible moment. Let's rifle through a box that contains all of the physicality of the game. First, you have a set of dice. It's a total of 15 d6s. 10 are your regular dice used for tests, and 5 are so-called passion dice, which are like penalty dice that you have to add to your dice pool occasionally. There are a few remarkable features about these dice, actually. The first is that they have a sort of soft feel to them, as if they were made of a flexible resin. I don't mean that they're soft to the touch. You can't scratch them with your fingernail or anything, but they feel and sound muffled. It's hard to explain. I really like that hint of softness. The second interesting thing is that they all have a hint of glitter in them. This is just a nice touch that you can really appreciate if you have good lighting. The third thing is that they glow in the dark, which I guess is good if you don't have good lighting. The next thing in the box is a branded ballpoint pen. To be honest, you kind of need to use a pencil with a eraser for this game with your character sheet, but here's a pen. Next is the standard version of the core rulebook, which runs 300 pages. It's got a glossy cover and is stitch bound, no bookmark, but it does have nice end papers. Here's a fridge magnet, and here's a bookmark promoting the official audio drama, Clawmore Heights, written by one of the game's authors, and which you can listen to on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts for free. I'll leave a link to that below. It's actually a really professionally produced piece of media, and you should check it out. But yeah, the book's internal paper quality is high. The colors are max quality and the paper is relatively thick. I'll be going over all of the highlights of this book later in this video, but you can see that the colors and the print quality are about as good as you can ask for. Really, the most important feature here is, again, the fact that the signatures are stitch bound. That's really important with a book composed of 300 heavy-ish pages. The deluxe edition of the rulebook sports a cloth cover with embossed letters and elements on the cover, de-embossed letters on the spine, and a ton of embossing on the back. You also get gilded page edges. My copy came with a fun little card that contains scratch-off elements to reveal a surprise character. This could be a lot of fun if you're running this game as a one-shot or at a game convention or something. Internally, the deluxe edition book has the same quality paper as the standard edition, but one extra thing it does have is 3 bookmarks. I guess that's 3 things. But yeah, 3 bookmarks in colors that happen to complement this amazing illustration at the beginning of the book. Finally, at the time of recording, there are 3 volumes of Whisper. These are zine-styled, staple-bound supplements that each contain snippets of fiction and other setting details written as in-world or diegetic materials. You're supposed to be reading what are essentially clippings from a magazine type of publication from within the world of the Dramark, and you'll find things like fashion as well as recipes. Most importantly, you'll find insights into the history and the society of the setting told from an internal perspective. But let's get into the actual book. Like I mentioned, you play as one of 3 factions, the first of which is the aristocracy. This is a small sliver of the remaining human population of the Dramark that, for the most part, just sits around and enjoys immense privilege. But this game is written with a lot of intelligence and nuance. Not all aristocrats are lazy and unproductive, and if your PC happens to be one, they don't have to fit that stereotype. The other thing worth noting about them generally is that these families intermarry and adopt people into their name without any strict requirements on consanguinity. In fact, there isn't even a whiff of racial division in this world, and the illustrations repeatedly depict that. The core book starts you off with 5 major aristocratic families, and the first of them is House Astus Willow. This family has a reputation of being the most curious about the Ruin, that unstoppable force of nature that arrived on the planet roughly a century ago, and which has corrupted all metal and living creatures that it reaches. They are the most principled of the houses, despite the study of the Ruin being taboo in many circles. House Belafine has the reputation of being hunters, fighters, and soldiers. They are also known as a house intent on beating back the corruption of the Ruin as it encroaches on civilization everywhere all the time. It's not clear if House Belafine has a standing army or vast armories full of weapons, but that's definitely not the aim of this game. I'll get to the mechanics in a minute, but it's worth noting now that this game is much more focused on storytelling rather than the nitty-gritty of logistics at the faction scale or any scale. House Dara is known for its expansionist nature, constantly trying to acquire new land in order to build more manors and buildings and properties. They have some reputation as being new money and have no qualms with bringing in members of the so-called true folk into their family in order to forge stronger ties with the working classes. House Galdapark is known as maybe the very richest of the aristocratic families, and many members have the reputation of being hedonistic. Since their indulgences are not limited by money, many folks brag about overcharging them for contract work or gouging them on prices. They're not all bad though. Unlike some of the other families, they might be more willing to fund expeditions into ruin-tainted territories and other ventures that might actually help humanity, but generally they're pretty frivolous and unfocused. Finally, there is House Valgrieve, known for their work with animals, both the normal kind and those that have been uplifted or otherwise modified. The most obvious touchstone that would come to mind here would be The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells and published in 1896. I didn't see that story mentioned in the media list in this book, but I'm definitely getting those vibes. House Valgrieve is also known for just being more practical than the other houses. They take pride in knowing how a house is run and in trying to understand how ruin works. True folk in this setting are the people who do all the work, who make all the things and essentially form the core of a functioning civilization. They're the workers, the butlers, the artisans, the writers, the builders, and everything in between. If you're left wondering what's the point of having an aristocracy if it's the true folk doing 99% of the work, and why should there be an entire class of people who do nothing but own everything and who consume 10 or 100 times more than a normal person, then you have begun to tackle a universal quandary about human existence that is central to this game. It's not so black and white, of course. Just as there are good aristocrats and bad ones, there are good and bad true folk. The setting establishes 5 true folk guilds, each occupying a major segment of civilization, and I guess to some abstract degree an economy. The first of these is Crown Hall College, a university made up of many different institutes and who uphold a strict adherence to academic standards and elitist apprenticeships. I think the greatest potential for stories with the college is the secrets that they have to cover up as a result of their research mishaps. This illustration depicts that plot hook pretty gruesomely, but effectively. The League of Glove and Key is essentially a butler's guild, but includes all domestic help like maids and other household staff. In this setting, you have household staff, and then you have glove and key household staff, who are trained to anticipate their master's every need and meet those needs, and otherwise be invisible. They operate almost as independent nation-states within each estate, rather than being centrally governed. Since they are in earshot of their aristocratic masters all the time, members of this guild accumulate incredibly powerful information that they usually keep to themselves. unless you want drama to happen, of course. There's also another source of drama, the politics of promotions within an estate's household staff. If you've ever watched Downton Abbey, you'll have an idea of the kinds of squabbles that the help can get themselves into. It could be really fascinating to run an entire campaign of Our Brilliant Ruin with a party of just glove and key butlers, maids, cooks, and chauffeurs, actually. There's no shortage of drama that could unfold, not to mention the monsters and vampires you can throw in there. The Peacock's Feast is essentially an artisans guild. Actors, writers, poets, painters, musicians, and even glass blowers, cheese makers, and other craftsfolk. Just like with the Glove and Key Guild, you have artisans and entertainers, and then you have Peacock's Feast artisans and entertainers, who are the most exceptionally talented in society. They do tend towards debauchery on the whole, so you could have a lot of fun with that. But I think the most interesting aspect of this guild is the fact that there are frauds among the ranks, just like in real life. Artists who garner immense fame and fortune, but who actually lack any genuine talent. This could be a fun theme to explore in a session, or even a whole multi-session story arc. The Piedmont Accord is the guild of agents. They can be hired to serve as couriers, brokers, financiers, reporters, mercenaries, and spies, among other things. They work by contract on an individual basis, so the Accord is more like a loose-knit alliance of contractor agents rather than an organization with a leader. Each agent is only as good as their reputation, so a job well done is the only way they'll ever build a career. In terms of violent action and daring do, it might pay to have a Piedmont agent in the group, at the very least as an NPC to help stir the pot. The last of the True Folk guilds is the Rivets and Bellows Union. This is probably the most self-explanatory guild of them all. It's a blue-collar workers' union, but a guild in the sense that the quality of work and mastery of one's field is paramount. It's suggested that union members find themselves more often than any other members of society on the front lines trying to beat back the ruin. This is usually with flamethrowers, so naturally this is a dangerous job, and it leads to lots of grisly deaths and transformations. The third major faction in the game is the Unbonded, who you can think of as people who just don't fit into any of the other categories. They aren't all necessarily violent rebels or homeless folks. They could come in the form of an independent entrepreneur or an eccentric but wealthy individual. The key feature is that they always operate at the fringes of society and reject the formalities baked into the other two factions. Well, actually, here are 7 unbonded archetypes. You have independent pioneers, former royalty, who in this setting are the descendants several generations removed from the ruling class who were scattered and decimated by the ruins' first arrival. Then there are psilokinetic experts. Okay, so this is a can of worms. Psilokinetics are a science fantasy category of technology that was created in the time of the royals. Each machine they built was huge and fully automated. Over the past century or so, they have mostly gone inert or fallen apart and have become hated by the general population, acting as a scapegoat for everyone's problems. And anyone who claims to have knowledge of psilokinetic technology also becomes the target of unwarranted and irrational hatred. But there are those who have kept the knowledge within their families or within secret groups all these generations, and by day they might masquerade as a true folk or even an aristocrat, but by night they work on repairing, restoring, and even improving some psilokinetic contraption or another. The next kind of unbonded you might play as or run into is a former true folk. This kind of character is likely made after violating their guild's rules and norms, or being ousted after losing in some internal political scuffle. Then you have dissidents and rebels. They are the ones organizing lynch mobs, boycotts, and riots, or quietly sabotaging one operation or another in the name of the people or whatever ideal helps them sleep at night. The next kind of unbonded is the member of the shadow economy. There are 3 named syndicates here, although the book doesn't really go into any detail about them. Essentially, these are just criminals, thieves, hired guns, fences, extortionists, etc. Maybe for fun, your party could play as a band of noble thieves, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, or just a bunch of scumbags like in Blades in the Dark. Whatever floats your boat. Finally, there are society outsiders who are very similar to the shadow economy syndicate criminals, but even more unbonded. street rats, pickpockets, informants, and highway robbers. Okay, so what is the ruin exactly? You don't really want to think of this phenomenon in terms of modern science fiction. It's not science-y. Think more in terms of science fantasy from the Jules Verne, H.G. Wells era of sci-fi. Cosmic rays of light or energy from a dead, distant star reached Earth about a century ago and began corroding much of the world's metal, even ore still in the ground. And it began transmogrifying humans into what are, for all intents and purposes, vampires, as well as flesh-eating ghouls who can pass themselves off as humans, and chimera, who are just awful mutants of any sort. Humankind has discovered 3 ways to fight it. Kinetic energy, aka physical violence. You can bash it and hack it to pieces. Not the light itself or the spores that come off of contaminated metal, but the mutants and the monsters. You can kind of just kill them normally. Then there's alcohol, which acts as a sort of poison to any creature contaminated by the ruin. So if you ever see a person at a soiree not drinking their wine, they might be a vampire. And finally, the most effective but destructive countermeasure of all is fire. I'm sort of glossing over a lot of the delicious little details about this setting, but I do want to pause here and note the sheer attention to detail about this world in which metal is no longer reliable and is now even a vector for cosmic contamination. The authors really did think this through quite a bit. Telephone lines, for example, are extremely useful, but if you have a wire leading into your home, there's the possibility of ruin traveling through that metal and getting into your house. So telephones are sort of rare. A guild might have one, a large estate might have 2. Now, I do think the authors did a little bit of hand-waving with power and electricity, sort of allowing it in estates a lot more than what would logically be allowed. But I think they did this in order to maintain a sense of modernity. There's the existence of a plastic-like material called polyresin, which can replace metal in a lot of instances. I think as the GM, you're not meant to account for every last place in the world where metal should be but isn't, or where metal is being used but shouldn't be. Yes, civilization has largely had to abandon the use of metal in day-to-day life, but you should really only be evoking this detail if it helps a scene be more interesting. Cars are rare, public transportation is slightly less rare, but metal, right? It's a difficult feature of the setting that you really shouldn't overthink. If you consider all the ramifications of cosmic light rendering metal pitted, corroded, and useless, even underground ore, then really you are completely removing yourself from the Victorian Edwardian era and entering something much more primordial. And then at that point you would lose a key aspect of the setting's aesthetic and identity. You just have to hand wave it a little bit. Okay, so here's how the game works. I'm going to hastily fill out a character sheet with you and walk you through each part of the game's rules in the process. You start by choosing one of 3 factions. Let's say I choose to be an aristocrat. My guy's name is Cormac. Surprisingly, all of those sub-factions and houses and guilds that we saw have no mechanical bearing on your character, which is to say, this game is very narrative in nature. Anyway, as an aristocrat, a Dara in fact, Cormac can allocate a point array for personality and for skills. Just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to allocate the points in the same exact order that they're presented in the book. Personality and skill traits can never exceed 3 points. Then I will allocate a point array for my portfolio. Aristocrats can have up to 5 in any portfolio item, while the other 2 factions can only have up to 3. And my aristocrat has 5 max distress and vitality points. Next I come up with an epigram, which is like my catchphrase. Since my guy has a 3 in access and 2 in both entourage and information, I like to think of him as a sort of self-styled hub of social information, someone who values networking above all else. His epigram would be, "You are who you know." Alright, so what do all these numbers actually mean? Let's say I'm trying to get into a very exclusive party. Not a party that my own family is hosting, but rather one from a rival family. But due to the story or whatever thing Cormac really wants, he really needs to get into this party, but he doesn't have an invitation. In this case, I would choose a personality and skill combination in which I have at least 1 point total. This is more of an art than a science, by the way, and the book continuously reminds you not to be too literal or to sweat it too much. Just pick a combo that you think feels best for what you're trying to do. Cormac is going to use Benevolence and Express. At Benevolence 2, others know you for your kindness and enjoy your company. And Express measures your ability to communicate ideas in the way that you want to. So basically, Cormac is trying to charm the guy at the door who's checking invitations. The total rating for my personality and skill in this case is 4, so I would roll 4 regular d6s. The hope is that I get at least one more 6 than I do a 1. If I rolled 2 6s and a 1, that's more 6s than 1s, and I have a success. If you happen to roll 3 6s and 3 1s, that would actually count as a success. That's called a triumph, and you get to narrate something special for your scene. If you rolled 3 6s but 4 1s, that would actually kill the triumph, and I hope that never happens to you. Now, if Cormac had an item or some environmental factor that gave him some advantage, the GM could add a die to the roll, but you can also lose dice in that same fashion. These portfolio points, on the other hand, are not telling me how many dice I can throw. They are expendable, replenishable meta points that I can spend to automatically succeed a test. Now, I'm not supposed to be able to just use one on the spot. Narratively, they are supposed to require some forethought and planning. Also, they don't replenish very quickly at all. By default, you just get 1 point back at the end of each session. So they're a very precious resource in the game. Then you have passions. Anytime when you're about to roll for a test and you have an empty passions box on your sheet, you can mark it and add 2 normal dice to your roll. Then when you roll, any 5s act as 6s, so they count towards a total for a success. You will eventually have to pay the piper though. In some encounters, your passions might get invoked. This means taking the number of passion boxes you have filled in passion dice and then adding them to your next roll. Also, if you fill all 5 boxes, then your very next test will have to include 5 passion dice. For these passion dice, the 6s don't count towards possible success. It's all downside with these dice. They either produce 1s or do nothing at all. But at least after your passion is invoked, you can clear the boxes. Vitality boxes are basically like physical hit points, and distress is your mental hit point system. As you accumulate damage to both, you could eventually fill one track or the other and pick up a condition. The 2 main conditions in play here are critically injured, if you fill up vitality damage, and critically distressed for distress boxes, both of which put you out of action until you can be healed or taken care of somehow. There's actually no comprehensive list of conditions. There are just 9 suggested conditions, but GMs are encouraged to make up their own as needed. Finally, there are schemes. Characters can take on 1 scheme at a time and work on it every day for 5, 10, or 15 days. Let's say, for example, that our guy Cormac Dara is trying to create a lab at his private residence in order to continue the development of an uplifted rabbit species that his father abandoned. Let's say that this is a 10-day scheme. We'd first have to choose an approach for this, and that test would be the same one we'd roll at the end of every in-game day. Let's say our approach is Defiance plus Craft. That would give me 3 dice to roll every day. Each time I rolled, I would record the result in this box for schemes. But it should be noted that any neutral rolls are actually counted as failures. If you roll more overall glooms than brills, then that roll result is considered a catastrophe. Anyway, this is a 10-day scheme. Once I've rolled 10 times, that is the result of my scheme. It's really hard to squeeze out success here without using passion, by the way, so you should get used to accumulating and rolling those passion dice in order to achieve what you want, especially with schemes, where otherwise neutral rolls are counted as glooms or failures. One more element that I wanted to touch on very briefly, but which is a favorite thing of mine in RPGs, is the shared home base character. They go by many names, but in this game, it's called the community property. These properties are rated 1 to 5, and the higher the rating, the more attributes and features can be added to the property. The attributes are a lot like the portfolio points that your character has. They are spendable, replenishable points. But depending on which one you as a group decide to spend, you actually get a specific mechanical reward. For example, if our estate had a point in Generate and we decided as a group to spend it, that would replenish 1 exhausted point of the tools and equipment or wealth portfolio attributes on one person's sheet. There are 7 minor and 5 major property features to choose from, and most of these also have a specific mechanical function in the game. These are a bit abstractly applied, so you just have to roll with it. I think by far my favorite innovation is this here. Each time you use a feature or attribute of your community property, you mark one box on this ruin track. There are 10 boxes for each circle and 10 circles. Each time you fill up 10 boxes, then that circle gets filled. When you get to 5 filled circles, you're locked out of your property's attributes. At 8 circles, your character might start picking up ruin-afflicted conditions if they stay on the property too long. And at 10 circles of ruin, you have lost the property. So to prevent that, you have to use the scheme system to beat back the ruin. Depending on how well you do on a 10-roll scheme, you could end up rolling back some of the ruin or advance it. This is one of the places in the game where the mechanics meet the theme and the setting really beautifully. There's so much more, but I've definitely kept you too long. Here are my thoughts on our brilliant ruin. Cons. All stat combos should be rollable. If you don't have points in a given personality and skill combination, you simply cannot roll on that combo at all. I'm sure the designers figured that makes the player focus more on the personality and skill traits that their PC does in fact have points in, but I think this ultimately limits the player and forces them to just use a subset of possible actions throughout a session. All traits with 0 points in them are essentially blocked off from any consideration. Now, that being said, I actually got to run these criticisms one by one to one of the authors, Justin Achilli, and he actually set the record straight. He told me that the action a character takes can be anything, and that the personality and skill combo just reflects the approach and motivation of the character. Also, you can use passion to add dice to a test in which you didn't have any points in, if you really wanted to. The dice rolls are punishing. The underlying dice mechanic of 1s canceling out 6s is actually quite punishing. This D6 dice pool hews very closely to Free League's Year Zero engine, except that you can't push rolls, and the 1s versus the 6s means that you're just not going to produce that many successes on average. It gets even more punishing when you consider the schemes and the community property ruination containment rolls actually count neutral results as glooms. It's obviously a design choice and not some accident that the dice are this punishing, and to be fair, you always have portfolio points to spend for automatic successes, as well as passion points and gear-related or environmental modifiers to juice up a roll, but those depend on the situation, come with a cost, and or replenish very slowly. So yeah, overall, the dice are kind of harsh in this game. I think as a GM, you just need to be creative enough to keep a scene moving forward, even when there are neutral or negative results on a test, because you'll be seeing those a lot. Okay, so here's what Justin says about this. Basically, only throw dice on things that are important. Don't be afraid to use passions. Technically, glooms do not subtract from brills. It's just a raw comparison. And failure is not bad. It's actually an engine for interesting storytelling as long as the GM and players have enough experience to make it so. Font is a bit small. This is a gripe that I have with the physical book and one that is easily sidestepped with the digital version, but I feel that the font size that they settled on for the main body text of the book is maybe 2 points too small for comfortable reading. My eyes are definitely going as I senesce, so this is more of a personal thing, but just to give you an idea of how I read this book, I enlarged the PDF on my computer screen to what would be the equivalent of a page that is 12 inches wide by around 18 inches tall. There is no easy solution for this with the printed book. Increasing the font size would require relaying out the entire book, and that's months of work. Or slightly easier would be to increase the font size, retain all of the page layouts, but cut sentences and words here and there until it all fits in the original layout. That's also never going to happen. If you have failing eyesight like me, you'll just need one of those magnifying glass reader things, or just settle for the PDF version. So they actually just took my input in on this, and maybe we'll see an improvement in the future. Whispers are fun and helpful, but adventures would be better. The 3 Whisper supplements published thus far are really the ultimate flex in creative writing, as well as world building from an indirect angle, The many short snippets of fiction and glimpses into the setting's past and present, the real recipes, as well as the cool artwork in the center of each one, can really get a GM and players more deeply entrenched into the look and feel of the world. But a more direct and useful tool would be a pamphlet of roughly the same length, but which contained adventures, such as the one found at the end of the core rulebook, Fortune's Turn at Crowscroft Manor. This format of adventure is immensely useful for a GM in having a location, NPCs, enemies, and a general outline of a story that can be used at the table. And here's what Justin had to say. Basically, they are going to publish more adventures, as well as other game resources that can be used directly by the GM. Nice. And okay, here are my pros. The setting is immensely inspiring. The mix of social stratification, social intrigue, decaying technology, and outright horror elements is just one of the most intriguing I've ever seen in a tabletop RPG. Each of these elements doesn't feel skin deep either. The class tensions feel very well informed and rooted in history and literature, and the source of the horror, this mysterious light from a distant star, achieves a sort of late 19th century science fantasy feel to it. It's sort of pitch perfect gothic science fantasy, rather than science fiction per se. Narrative-focused mechanics give the story room to breathe. It's all subjective. Some people like the crunch and the simulation or sensation of simulation when it comes to combat and in-game logistics, and other people would rather just focus on the story. This game expects you to have a loose interpretation of the personality plus skill combos for tests, and you're spending portfolio points almost as a meta currency. It's a softer rule set, but I like it because the setting needs a bit of elbow room. Community property mechanics. I love a shared headquarters in RPGs where the home base acts as an extra playable character almost. And in this case, I especially appreciate the ruin and ruin mitigation mechanics where you're constantly having to beat back the encroachment of entropy on your property. Art and presentation are extraordinary. This is clearly a team of veteran media creators. Their backgrounds in video games and other big entertainment industries definitely shows in the quality of the illustrations and layout. PDF is free. Somewhat inexplicably, the PDF for this game is absolutely free. Everything is free. It's not just the PDF that's free. You can go to their website and download the press kit, which contains all kinds of maps, graphical elements, streaming assets, just all kinds of stuff. Book and dice quality are excellent. I've mentioned this in other videos, but I've gotten really spoiled by physical RPGs in the indie and third-party world. It seems like every book I get is this marvelous stitch-bound, bookmarked tome that will last 50 years of use at the table. And more often than not, the specialty dice for these games are so cool and addictive to hold and to roll. I just don't think twice about it anymore, but I should really try to remind myself that these physical products are special. Professionally produced audio drama. The Clawmore Heights audio drama, which you can find on YouTube and Spotify and everywhere else, is extremely well produced and acted. It puts you in the world of the Dramark and really gets your head into the setting. The only drawback to it is that the episodes are relatively short and it always leaves you wanting more. Ample media touchstones. There are enough TV shows and novels and games cited in the inspiration section of this book that you'll be able to get a very firm grasp on the setting's origins and its intent. Nicest looking index I've ever seen. This is kind of minor, but I ended up finding it extremely helpful when I needed to look something up. The color coding is extremely handy, and the bulleted sub-entries are a feature I don't think I've ever seen in an RPG. And if you're using the PDF, each of these entries is linked to the page, so you can just click on it and get there instantly. So yeah, that's our brilliant ruin. I'll leave links to everything below. Let me know your thoughts on this game, especially if you've played or run it yourself. Thanks as always for watching. See ya.